Prepare yourself for a journey beyond the ordinary, into the shadows of your deepest fears. Welcome to the world of Mr. Scary Guy. It was the summer of 2019 when my friends and I decided to take a fishing trip to a remote lake in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. We were looking for a weekend getaway, something to escape the stresses of our daily lives. Little did we know, this trip would be anything but relaxing. We arrived at the lake on a Friday afternoon, the sun high in the sky, casting a golden glow over the still waters. The scenery was breathtaking. Dense forests surrounded the lake, and there wasn't another soul in sight. It felt like we had the entire world to ourselves. Setting up camp was the first order of business. We pitched our tents close to the water's edge, making sure we had a clear view of the lake. The air was fresh, with the scent of pine and earth, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. We were ready for a peaceful weekend. As the sun began to set, we lit a fire and settled in for the night. We shared stories and roasted marshmallows, laughing and joking under a sky full of stars. It felt perfect, like something out of a movie. But as the night grew darker, an uneasy feeling started to creep in. The woods around us seemed to close in, and the sounds of the forest became unnervingly loud. We shrugged off the feeling and decided to turn in for the night. I had trouble falling asleep, tossing and turning in my sleeping bag. I kept hearing strange noises, twigs snapping, rustling leaves, and what sounded like distant whispers. I told myself it was just the forest, but deep down, I felt something was off. Morning came, and with it, a sense of relief. The unease of the night was gone, replaced by the excitement of a day spent fishing. We grabbed our gear and headed to a small dock that extended into the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the blue sky above, and it seemed like a perfect day for fishing. Hours passed and we caught a few fish, but the eerie feeling from the night before started to return. The forest around us felt too quiet, as if holding its breath. We decided to take a break and explore a bit, hoping to shake off the feeling. We found a narrow trail leading into the woods and followed it, curious to see where it led. The trail twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the forest. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the sunlight. It felt like we were walking into another world, one where time stood still. After what felt like an eternity, we stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. The cabin was in ruins, its wooden walls rotting and the roof caved in. But there was something about it that drew us in. We pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the floor was littered with debris. In the corner of the room, we found an old, tattered journal. The journal was filled with handwritten entries, detailing the life of a man who had once lived in the cabin. The entries started off mundane, but as we read on, they became more and more disturbing. The man wrote about hearing voices, seeing figures in the woods, and feeling like he was being watched. His final entry was a frantic scrawl warning anyone who found the journal to leave immediately. We left the cabin, the unease now a palpable fear. The sun was beginning to set, and we hurried back to our campsite. The forest seemed darker, the shadows longer, and every sound made us jump. By the time we reached our tents, it was nightfall. We decided to pack up and leave the next morning, hoping daylight would bring back some sense of normalcy. That night was the worst. The noises outside our tents were louder, closer. We heard footsteps circling our camp, whispers that seemed to come from all around us. At one point, I thought I saw a figure standing by the edge of the woods, but when I blinked, it was gone. None of us slept, too afraid to close our eyes. At dawn, we hurriedly packed up and left, not bothering to eat or clean up. As we drove away, I glanced back at the lake, half expecting to see someone or something watching us. The journey home was silent, each of us lost in our thoughts, trying to make sense of what had happened. Weeks later, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Strange things started happening at home. Objects moving on their own, whispers in the night, and shadows that didn't belong. I started having nightmares, always the same. The cabin, the journal, and a dark figure standing at the edge of the woods. I did some research and found out that the area around the lake had a history of strange disappearances and ghost sightings. Locals believed the lake was cursed, that it was a place where the boundary between our world and another was thin. I tried to forget, to move on, but the feeling of dread lingered. One night I woke up to find my bedroom door wide open. I knew I had closed it before going to bed. As I got up to shut it, I heard a familiar rustling sound from outside my window. My heart pounded as I peeked through the curtains. There in the moonlit yard was the dark figure from my nightmares, standing motionless, staring up at me. The figure slowly raised its hand, pointing directly at me. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I knew I couldn't stay there. I grabbed my keys and fled, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away. I drove for hours. The image of that figure burned into my mind. I eventually found myself at a motel on the outskirts of town. Exhausted, I checked in and collapsed on the bed. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept seeing shadows moving in the corners of the room, hearing whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. It was like the figure had followed me. The next morning, I decided to go back to the lake. I needed answers, and the only place I might find them was at that cabin. The drive was long and filled with dread. When I arrived, the lake looked as serene as ever, but it felt like a mask hiding something sinister. I made my way back to the cabin, the path now familiar. Inside, everything was as we had left it. I found the journal and began to read the last entry again, hoping to find something I had missed. That's when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I turned around slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. There, standing in the doorway, was the dark figure. It was clearer now, more real. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure stepped closer, its presence suffocating. As it reached out to me, everything went black. When I woke up, I was back in my car, parked at the edge of the lake. My head was pounding and my body ached. I looked around, but the figure was gone. I drove home in a daze, trying to piece together what had happened. To this day, I don't know if it was all real or just a nightmare, but I haven't gone back and I never will. The lake may look peaceful, but something dark lingers there, something that doesn't want to be disturbed. I've always prided myself on being a strong, rational man. My name is Jack and I'm in my early 50s. I've spent my entire life working hard to provide for my family. But as my son Jason entered his teenage years, we seemed to drift apart. It was clear we needed some father-son bonding time, something to bridge the growing gap between us. So I planned a weekend fishing trip to a remote lake deep in the woods, a place I had fond memories of from my own childhood. The trip started early on a crisp autumn morning. Jason and I packed our gear into my old pickup truck and set off. The drive was long and winding, but the scenery was breathtaking. The further we drove, the more the stress of everyday life seemed to melt away. We talked about his school, his friends, and his favorite video games. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a genuine connection forming between us. We arrived at the lake just before noon. It was exactly as I remembered, a pristine, mirror-like body of water surrounded by dense forest, with only the sound of nature to break the silence. We set up our tent on a small clearing near the shore, and by early afternoon, we were ready to fish. The first day went by peacefully. We caught a few fish, told stories, and laughed. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, we cooked our catch over a campfire. It felt like the perfect day, one that would be the beginning of a stronger bond between us. That night, however, things started to feel off. It was the kind of feeling you get when you sense someone watching you, even though you're alone. As we lay in our tent, the gentle rustling of the leaves and the distant calls of nocturnal animals were the only sounds. But beneath those natural noises, there was something else, something faint but unmistakable. It was a low, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to resonate from the lake itself. I dismissed it as my imagination, chalking it up to the isolation and the quiet of the woods. Jason, thankfully, seemed oblivious and fell asleep quickly. I, however, lay awake for hours, listening to that eerie hum until exhaustion finally claimed me. The next morning, the hum was gone, replaced by the familiar sounds of the forest. We decided to explore the area a bit before resuming our fishing. We hiked along the shoreline, discovering hidden coves and small, secluded beaches. It was on one of these beaches that we found something strange. An old, weathered boat partially buried in the sand. It looked ancient, its wood rotted and splintered, as if it had been there for decades.
"Look, Dad,"
Jason said, pointing to the boat.
"do you think it still works?"
"I doubt it," I replied, examining the decaying vessel. "It's been here a long time." As we continued to inspect the boat, I noticed something etched into the wood near the bow. It was a name, Livia. The letters were faded, but still legible. There was something unsettling about it, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. We left the boat behind and continued our hike, but the discovery lingered in my mind. That evening we fished again, catching enough for dinner. As we sat by the campfire, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. I scanned the darkening forest, but saw nothing out of the ordinary.
"Dad, do you hear that?"
Jason asked, his voice tinged with unease. I listened carefully, and there it was again, the low hum from the night before. This time, Jason heard it too. It seemed to be coming from the lake, growing louder and more insistent. "Maybe it's just the wind," I suggested, though I didn't believe it myself. Jason nodded, but he didn't look convinced. We finished our meal in silence and retired to the tent. The hum persisted, rising and falling like some sort of grotesque lullaby. Sleep was impossible. I lay there, heart pounding, every nerve on edge. Around midnight, the hum abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a light. It was a faint, bluish glow coming from the direction of the lake. I shook Jason awake. "Do you see that?" I whispered. He rubbed his eyes and looked out of the tent.
"Yeah, what is it?"
"I don't know," I admitted. "Stay here, I'm going to check it out."
"No way,"
he protested.
"I'm coming with you."
I didn't have the heart to argue, so together we crept out of the tent and made our way towards the lake. The light grew brighter as we approached, pulsating gently. When we reached the shore, we saw it. A figure standing on the water, surrounded by the eerie blue light. It was a woman, her form translucent and shimmering. She wore a dress that seemed to flow like water, her long hair drifting around her as if she were underwater. Her eyes were empty voids, and her mouth moved soundlessly, as if she were singing a song we couldn't hear. I wanted to run, to grab Jason and flee, but I was rooted to the spot. The woman raised her hand and pointed towards the boat we had found earlier. Then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she vanished, leaving only the lingering glow of the light.
"What the hell was that?"
Jason whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, my own fear barely contained. "But we're leaving. Now." We hurried back to our campsite, packed up our gear as quickly as possible, and drove away from that cursed place. The whole drive back, Jason and I were silent, each lost in our own thoughts, trying to make sense of what we had seen. It wasn't until we were safely back home that I decided to do some research. I discovered that the lake had a dark history. Decades ago, a young woman named Livia had drowned there under mysterious circumstances. Her body was never recovered, and it was said that her spirit still haunted the lake, luring the unwary to their doom. I shared this with Jason, and we both agreed never to speak of our experience again. But the memory of that weekend still haunts me. Sometimes late at night, I can still hear that low hum, a reminder of the horrors we encountered. Years have passed, and Jason and I have grown closer. But the bond we formed came at a terrible price. The lake's call still echoes in my mind, a chilling reminder that some places are best left undisturbed. And every time I hear the hum, I wonder if Livia's spirit is still out there, waiting for her next victims. Last Independence Day weekend, I decided to take a trip to a cabin in the woods with my girlfriend, Emily. We wanted to escape the city and enjoy some peace and quiet. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by dense forest, and had no neighbors for miles. It seemed like the perfect getaway. We arrived on Friday evening, unpacked, and settled in. The first night was peaceful, and we spent it sitting on the porch, watching the stars and listening to the distant sound of fireworks. On Saturday, we went hiking and explored the area. By the time we got back to the cabin, it was getting dark. We made dinner and settled in for the night, planning to watch a movie. Around 10 p.m., just as the movie started, we heard a loud noise outside. It sounded like something had fallen over on the porch. Emily and I exchanged worried glances. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously opened the door. The porch was empty, but I noticed the rocking chair had been knocked over. I walked around the cabin, shining the flashlight into the woods, but saw nothing. I chalked it up to an animal and went back inside. We tried to resume the movie, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Around midnight, we heard another noise, this time from the back of the cabin. It sounded like someone tapping on the window. I grabbed the flashlight again and crept to the back room. As I approached the window, the tapping stopped. I shone the light outside, but saw only darkness. Emily was scared, and I was starting to get really freaked out. We decided to leave the next morning. I locked all the doors and windows, hoping to get some sleep. But just as we were about to fall asleep, we heard a loud bang on the front door. It sounded like someone was trying to break in. I told Emily to hide in the bathroom while I called the police. The banging continued, growing more frantic. I held the door shut with all my strength, praying the police would arrive soon. After what felt like an eternity, I heard sirens in the distance. The banging stopped, and I opened the door to find no one there. The police arrived and searched the area but found no signs of anyone. They told us it was likely a prank, but we decided to cut our trip short and head home. The experience left us both shaken, and I haven't been back to that cabin since. As we drove away, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over me. The cabin, once a place of tranquility and escape, had become a source of fear and anxiety. Emily and I talked about the incident on the drive home, trying to rationalize what had happened. We considered the possibility of local pranksters or even wild animals, but nothing seemed to fit the eerie sequence of events we experienced. Back in the city, we tried to resume our normal lives, but the memory of that night haunted us. Emily had nightmares about the cabin, waking up in a cold sweat, convinced that someone was watching her. I found myself constantly checking the locks on our apartment door, a lingering sense of dread hanging over me. One night, about a month after our trip, Emily and I were out for dinner when we overheard a conversation at the next table. A group of people were talking about strange occurrences in the same area where our cabin was located. They mentioned unexplained noises, sightings of shadowy figures, and even reports of people disappearing. I was really scared as I listened, the familiar fear creeping back in. Determined to understand what had happened, I started researching the area. I found stories and forum posts from others who had experienced similar events. There were rumors of an old cult that once operated in those woods, performing rituals and sacrifices. The cabin, it seemed, was located near what was once their gathering spot. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that our experience was not just a simple prank or the result of wild animals. Something darker and more sinister was at play. Emily and I decided to seek help from a paranormal investigator, hoping to find some closure and put our fears to rest. The investigator agreed to visit the cabin with us, equipped with cameras, sensors, and other tools to detect paranormal activity. As we made our way back to the cabin, the familiar sense of dread returned. The investigator set up equipment around the property, and we waited anxiously as night fell. Throughout the night, the equipment picked up strange readings, unexplained fluctuations in temperature, odd sounds, and even faint whispers. The investigator confirmed that there was indeed some form of paranormal activity in the area, possibly linked to the old cult. While this provided some validation for our experience, it did little to ease our fears. Emily and I decided never to return to that cabin again. We sold the property and used the money to take a much-needed vacation somewhere far away from the woods. The experience taught us to be cautious and to trust our instincts. Even now, years later, the memory of that eerie cabin retreat lingers in our minds, a constant reminder of the unknown lurking just beyond the edges of our reality. I've always loved the outdoors. Growing up in a small town surrounded by dense forests, hiking was my escape from the mundane. This story happened a few years ago, when I decided to go on a solo hiking trip to clear my mind. It was meant to be a peaceful retreat, but it turned into a nightmare I can never forget. It was late autumn, and the trees were ablaze with shades of red, orange, and yellow. I packed my backpack with all the essentials: food, water, a map, a compass, and a small tent. I chose a trail I'd never explored before, one that was known for its beautiful scenery, but also for being less traveled. Perfect for some solitude, or so I thought. The first day was everything I hoped for. The trail was challenging but rewarding, offering breathtaking views of the forest and the distant mountains. I set up camp near a small stream, made a fire, and enjoyed the tranquility. As the sun set, I felt a deep sense of peace wash over me. Little did I know, this was the calm before the storm. The first strange occurrence happened that night. I woke up around midnight to the sound of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, circling my tent. I held my breath, listening intently. The steps stopped right outside, and I could hear faint breathing. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what it could be. Maybe it was an animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I reached for my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent. I shone the light outside, but there was nothing there. The forest was eerily silent. I convinced myself it was just my imagination and tried to go back to sleep, but it was a restless night. The next day, I continued my hike, trying to shake off the unease from the night before. The trail became steeper and more rugged, and I had to focus on my footing. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing with an old, dilapidated cabin in the center. It looked abandoned for years, with its roof caving in and windows shattered. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a closer look. As I approached the cabin, I noticed strange symbols carved into the door. They were unfamiliar and gave me a chill. I pushed the door open, and it creaked loudly, echoing through the empty forest. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of decay. The floor was covered in debris, and old, rusted tools hung on the walls. In the corner, there was a small table with a dusty journal on it. I picked it up and flipped through the pages. Most of the entries were mundane, detailing the daily life of whoever lived there. But the last few pages were different. They were frantic, filled with paranoid ramblings about being watched and hunted by something in the woods. A sense of dread washed over me, and I decided it was time to leave. As I stepped outside, I felt like I was being watched. I looked around, but there was no one there. The feeling persisted as I made my way back to the trail. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made my heart skip a beat. I quickened my pace, wanting to put as much distance between myself and that cabin as possible. As dusk approached, I found a spot to set up camp. I chose a location far from the trail, hoping it would give me some sense of security. That night, the forest was unnaturally quiet. No owls hooting, No insects chirping, just silence. I built a fire, hoping it would keep whatever was out there at bay. But as the night wore on, the sense of being watched grew stronger. Around midnight, the footsteps returned. This time, they were more aggressive, like someone running through the forest. They stopped right outside my tent, and I heard a low, guttural growl. My blood ran cold. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, ready to defend myself. I unzipped the tent and shone the light outside. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. The growling stopped, but the oppressive feeling of being watched remained. I didn't sleep at all that night. As soon as dawn broke, I packed up my things and started back down the trail. I was exhausted, but adrenaline kept me moving. I needed to get out of those woods. The hike back was grueling. The trail seemed more difficult than before, like it was trying to keep me there. I stumbled and fell several times, scraping my hands and knees. But I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. As I neared the trailhead, I felt a glimmer of hope. But that hope was shattered when I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, carved into a tree, were the same strange symbols I'd seen on the cabin door. Fresh, like they'd just been made. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. How could someone have gotten ahead of me? And why were they leaving these symbols? Panic set in, and I broke into a run. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just wanted to get to my car and leave. But the forest seemed to close in around me, the trees growing denser, the shadows deeper. I could hear the footsteps again, matching my pace, never falling behind. Finally, I broke through the tree line and saw the parking lot. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. My car, which I'd left locked and secured, had its windows shattered. The tires were slashed, and those same symbols were carved into the hood. I was trapped. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Desperation took over, and I started running down the road, hoping to find someone, anyone, who could help. But the road was deserted. I ran for what felt like hours, my legs burning, my lungs aching. As night fell, I found myself back in the forest. I had somehow gone in a circle. Exhausted and terrified, I knew I couldn't keep running. I found a large tree and climbed up, hoping it would offer some protection. As I settled onto a branch, I heard the footsteps again. They circled the base of the tree, slow and deliberate. I stayed as still as possible, barely breathing. Hours passed, and the footsteps never left. I could feel my body giving out, but I knew I couldn't come down. At some point, I must have fallen asleep out of sheer exhaustion. When I woke up, it was dawn. The footsteps were gone, but the symbols were carved into the tree trunk, right below where I was sitting. With renewed determination, I climbed down and started walking again. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to keep moving. Eventually, I stumbled upon a ranger station. I must have looked like a madman, covered in dirt and blood, babbling about symbols and footsteps. But the ranger took me in, gave me water, and called for help. It took days for me to fully comprehend what had happened. The authorities found my car, but no trace of whoever, or whatever, had been stalking me. They chalked it up to a bear or some other animal, but I knew better. There was something in those woods, something that didn't want me to leave. I haven't gone hiking since. The forest, once my sanctuary, is now a place of nightmares. I still see those symbols in my dreams, and I can't shake the feeling of being watched. If you ever find yourself in those woods, be careful. You might not come out. That's my story. Believe it or not, it's up to you. But I hope it serves as a warning. Some places are meant to be left alone. It was supposed to be the perfect night. Emily and I had just left this incredible concert. You know, the kind that leaves your ears ringing, but in a good way? We were both 18, fresh out of high school, And that night, we felt like we were on top of the world. The drive home was supposed to be the easy part, just a couple of hours down a quiet country road back to our small town. But then, out of nowhere, my car started acting up. The engine sputtered, and before I could pull over, it died completely. I cursed under my breath as I eased the car to the side of the road. We were stuck. Middle of nowhere, no cell service. Just me, Emily, and miles of dark, empty road stretching out in both directions. Emily tried to stay calm, but I could see the fear creeping in.
Maybe we should walk back to the gas station we passed a while ago,
she suggested. That's miles back, I told her, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Let's just wait a bit, someone's bound to come by. An hour passed. Silence. Not even a car in sight. Just the dark woods surrounding us, pressing in. Then finally headlights appeared in the distance, a faint glow slowly getting brighter. I jumped out of the car and started waving my arms, desperate to flag down whoever was driving. A big truck pulled over. The guy driving looked friendly enough, middle-aged with a big smile plastered across his face.
You kids need a ride?
He asked. Emily looked at me with uncertainty, but we didn't have a lot of options. Yeah, our car broke down. Think you can drop us off in the next town? I asked, trying to sound casual.
Sure thing,
the driver said.
Hop in.
We climbed into the cab. I sat up front while Emily slid into the back. The driver introduced himself as Earl, and he seemed like a decent guy, making small talk about the concert and how these roads can be tricky at night. For a while it was fine, but after about 15 minutes, something felt off. Earl stopped talking. The radio buzzed with static, and the only sounds left were the rain tapping on the windshield and the low hum of the engine. Earl's smile faded and his grip on the steering wheel tightened. We turned off the main road onto a narrow, winding path that didn't look familiar. Earl? Is this the right way? I asked, trying to keep the unease out of my voice.
Shortcut,
he mumbled, eyes fixed dead ahead. Emily leaned forward from the back seat.
Jason, I don't like this,
she whispered. Her hand clutched my shoulder and I could feel her fear. I don't like it either, I muttered back. I turned to Earl again. Actually, could you just let us out here? I asked. We'll walk the rest of the way. And that's when it happened. Earl's whole face twisted, his eyes darkened, and his voice wasn't human anymore.
You're not going anywhere,
he growled. I froze. The sound of the truck doors locking echoed through the cab. I grabbed the handle and yanked at it, but it was no use. We were trapped. Emily screamed and the truck swerved violently. Earl was laughing now, this sick, guttural sound that made my stomach churn. The truck barreled down the road faster and faster, the trees outside blurring into a wall of black. Then, out of nowhere, the truck screeched to a stop. Earl turned his head toward me, his eyes glowing a deep, unnatural red.
You should have stayed in your car,
he snarled and lunged at me. I don't know how, but I fought back. In the chaos, Emily managed to unlock the door and we both tumbled out onto the wet, muddy road. We didn't stop. We ran. We ran as fast as we could, the sound of Earl's maniacal laughter ringing in our ears. Behind us, the truck roared to life again, its headlights bearing down on us. We kept running, our shoes slipping on the slick asphalt. Just as the truck was about to reach us, it suddenly veered off the road and slammed into a tree with a sickening crunch. We stopped, panting, staring at the wreck. Flames licked up from the hood, but Earl was gone. The cab was empty. We didn't stick around to find out more. We ran until we found help in the next town. But no matter how far we got from that night, the terror never left us. Sometimes on dark roads, I swear I still see headlights in the distance creeping closer. I remember that weekend vividly, every detail etched into my memory like a nightmare that refuses to fade. It started as a simple plan, just me and my girlfriend Emily, heading out to a secluded lake for some quality time and fishing. It was a place I hadn't visited in years, not since my dad passed away. He used to take me there every summer when I was a kid. Those were some of the best times of my life, and I wanted to share that piece of my past with Emily. We packed up my old truck early Saturday morning, excited for a weekend of relaxation and nostalgia. The drive to the lake was peaceful, with the morning sun casting a warm glow over the winding country roads. Emily leaned against me, dozing off as the miles rolled by. I couldn't help but smile, feeling a sense of contentment that I hadn't felt in a long time. The lake was just as I remembered it, still, serene, and surrounded by dense forest. We set up our tent near the water's edge, unpacked our gear, and spent the afternoon fishing from the old wooden dock. The air was filled with the sounds of nature, the gentle lapping of water against the shore, and the occasional call of a distant bird. It was perfect. As evening approached, we decided to build a campfire and cook the fish we'd caught. The fire crackled and popped, casting flickering shadows around our campsite. We ate, laughed, and talked about everything and nothing. It felt like we were the only two people in the world. Later that night, after the fire had died down to glowing embers, Emily and I crawled into our tent. The sounds of the forest lulled us to sleep, but it wasn't long before I was jolted awake by a strange noise. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling the trees, but then I heard it again, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. I sat up, straining to hear. The whispering continued, growing louder and more distinct. It sounded like someone was speaking in a language I couldn't understand, their voice low and urgent. I glanced over at Emily, who was still sound asleep. I didn't want to wake her, so I grabbed a flashlight and quietly unzipped the tent. The night was dark and eerily quiet. I shone the flashlight around the campsite, but there was no sign of anyone. The whispering had stopped, replaced by the usual nighttime sounds of the forest. I stood there for a moment, feeling a chill creep up my spine, before deciding to go back to bed. The next day was uneventful. We spent the morning fishing and exploring the woods, enjoying the simple pleasure of being outdoors. But that night, the whispering returned. This time, it was louder and more insistent. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the lake. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I woke Emily and told her what I was hearing. She looked at me with a mix of concern and skepticism, but agreed to come with me to investigate. We grabbed our flashlights and headed towards the lake, the whispering growing louder with each step. As we reached the shore, the whispering stopped abruptly. We stood there, scanning the area with our flashlights, but saw nothing unusual. The lake was calm, the surface reflecting the pale light of the moon. We were about to turn back when Emily pointed to something in the water. There, floating just beneath the surface, was a shadowy figure. It was hard to make out, but it looked like a person. My heart raced as I waded into the water, reaching out to touch it. As soon as my hand made contact, the figure dissolved into nothing, leaving the water still and undisturbed. Emily and I hurried back to the campsite, our minds racing with questions. What was that? Were we both just imagining things? We didn't have any answers, but we agreed to stay close to the tent for the rest of the night. The following day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, but every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. Emily tried to reassure me, but I could tell she was just as unnerved as I was. That night, the whispering returned, louder and more insistent than ever. It seemed to be coming from all around us, echoing through the trees and across the water. We huddled together in the tent, too afraid to go outside. The whispering grew louder, turning into a cacophony of voices, each one speaking in that strange, unintelligible language. Suddenly, the tent was filled with a blinding light. We scrambled to our feet, trying to figure out what was happening. The light was coming from the direction of the lake, and it was so bright that it hurt to look at it. We stumbled out of the tent, shielding our eyes, and made our way towards the source of the light. As we reached the shore, the light began to fade, revealing a scene that I'll never forget. Standing in the water were dozens of shadowy figures, their eyes glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light. They were staring at us, their mouths moving in unison as they whispered their strange incantations. We were frozen in place, unable to move or speak. The figures began to advance towards us, their voices growing louder and more insistent. I felt a cold, clammy hand grip my arm, and I knew we had to get out of there. We turned and ran, not stopping until we reached the truck. We threw our gear into the back and sped away from the lake, the whispering voices echoing in our minds. We didn't stop until we were miles away, too exhausted and terrified to go any further. When we finally made it back to civilization, we tried to make sense of what had happened. We searched for answers, looking into the history of the lake and the surrounding area. We discovered that the lake had a dark past, filled with tales of mysterious disappearances and unexplained deaths. Some said it was cursed, that the spirits of those who had died there were trapped, unable to move on. We never went back to that lake, and we rarely talk about what happened. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispering. It's faint, barely audible, but it's there, reminding me that some places are better left forgotten. And every time I hear it, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if we hadn't escaped. What if those shadowy figures had caught us? What if we had become part of the lake's dark history? The thought chills me to the bone, and I can't help but feel a deep sense of dread whenever I think about that weekend. It was supposed to be a simple fishing trip, a chance to relive happy memories and create new ones. But instead, it turned into a nightmare that haunts me to this day. Emily and I have moved on with our lives, but the experience has left its mark on both of us. We still go camping and fishing, but we stick to well-traveled areas and never venture too far from other people. We never speak of the lake or the events that transpired there, as if acknowledging it would somehow make it real again. Despite our best efforts, the memory of that weekend lingers. There are nights when I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that I can hear the whispering again. I tell myself it's just my imagination, a lingering echo of the fear we experienced. But deep down, I know the truth. Some things can't be explained or rationalized away. Some nightmares never truly end. And so, I live with the knowledge that the world is a far stranger and more terrifying place than I ever realized. I try to push the memories away, to focus on the present and the future, but they always find a way to creep back in, reminding me of the darkness that lies just beneath the surface. Another night, another scare. Leave your comments below and don't hesitate to send in your own creepy tales. And remember, the real horror begins when the lights go out. This is Mr. Scary Guy saying, sleep well if you can.